Season 7 has just come and gone. In the process, the show has definitely taken us through some peaks and valleys emotionally. Mostly valleys, though. But if you've read the comics, you might have noticed some similarities between the two, accompanied by a plethora of differences. If you're afraid and frightened of spooky spoilers, turn back this instant. Anywho, from an overall perspective, Season 7 of the show is more or less along the arc of Volume 19, March to War. So before the show can get to all-out war, why don't we break this thing down and cover some of the big moments and how they compare between panel to screen. First and foremost, let's move past the brutal part. Glenn's death in the beginning of the season is almost shot for shot the same as the scene in issue 100. There are a couple of differences though. Mainly, the addition of Abraham's death in the show, whereas Abraham dies in the comic during a supply run with Eugene in issue 98. Sounds like a certain Denise's death in season 6 of the show, am I right? Across Westeros, we arrive at the Kingdom. Carol gets to meet Ezekiel, who breaks down and confesses to Carol that Ezekiel the Mighty is simply a character, a facade to give hope to his people. Ezekiel does this as well in the comics, but since Carol is no longer in the comics at this point, his talk happens with Michonne, whom he ends up having a romance with. So in the comics, there's no Michonne. Oh no! When Negan and his men visit Alexandria for the first time in episode 704, we get a pretty similar story to the comic. They sprinkled in a little bit of Spencer and Rosita's supply run, along with Michonne being super duper awful at shooting a rifle. But otherwise they mirror each other almost perfectly. By this point, Gregory is already on Maggie's nerves. He's a true piece of shit, and Maggie drops the haymaker of justice upon his sweet little face. This also happens in the comic books. However, it happens much later in issue number 118 after the war has already begun and the sides are arguing about what their next move will be. In episode 707 of the show, there are a lot of parallels to the comic. First off is Carl's massacre of a crazy, sickening, disgusting, horrific amount of henchmen. Exactly the same amount as in the show. See? One major difference though, Jesus accompanies him to Saviorland. In the comics, Jesus is on the road, but he doesn't join Carl on his journey to Negan's lair. Instead of punishing Carl, Negan decides to take him under his wing, and in both versions, the two characters sit down and have a serious, deep discussion. Negan convinces Carl to be a friggin' man and sack up, show your eye hole, kid. Carl obliges in both mediums.
Christ!
Onto the iron. Just like in the comics, Negan puts a burning hot iron to the face of Marcus Aurelius. Before doing such a super mean thing, Negan gives a speech to everyone.
I wish I could just ignore the rules and let it slide, but I can't.
The major difference is Amber calling out to Mark in the comics, and Dwight strikes her. When Sherry and Dwight talk afterwards, in the comics, Dwight calls her a bitch, which is even more super friggin' mean. The super mean stuff doesn't stop there. Spencer's death is almost mirrored precisely between issue number 111 and the halfway mark in the show's season, resulting in Negan slicing his little tummy right open. In the comics, Denise rushes to his side, but was way dead by this point in the show. Remember, we talked about this guy's death, season 6, Abraham's, similar. This segues into Rosita's assassination attempt in the show. As you've noticed by now, the first half of the season stays pretty true to the comics, sticking closely to the story Robert Kirkman had already written. The beginning of season 7B and Rosita's murder attempt right before that marked the fork in the road where the two began to separate noticeably. When she shoots at Negan, but ends up hitting Lucille and fucking that bad up a bit, it takes one of the first sharp turns away from the comics since the season began. This event does happen in the comic, but Carl is the one who shoots and hits Lucille instead of Rosita, and it happens when our heroes attack the Saviors in issue number 113. This leads to Negan lining up some more Alexandrians, but we'll get to that in a moment. In the show, Rosita's shot happens directly after Spencer's death, resulting in Olivia getting slapped across the head with a bullet. Then the Saviors leave, Rick doesn't retaliate, and the squad heads over to the hilltop to ask for Gregory's help in fighting, where Daryl and Rick reunite. A similar note, Eugene does get taken to the sanctuary in both formats, but we decided to make old Euge in the show into a real fucking asshole.
I'm Negan.
Now, let's get some of the huge foils out of the way. The lawnmower of a plan doesn't happen in the comics at all. The community of Oscar the Grouches is a completely new aspect to the Walking Dead universe. So there's no spiky bad boy or no crazy leader lady. Neither exists in the comics. Oceanside proves to be important in the show, not necessarily by creating another alliance, but becoming key to finding more guns for the trash people. However, in the comics, Oceanside is barely a blip on the radar. It serves as a location for Rick to reunite with Michonne later in the comics in issue number 139, after leaving the group in number 126 because she got a kick-ass multi-million-dollar offer to star in the Telltale games. This is also a good time to bring up the Barnacle babies. These guys. They don't exist at all in the comics, but in the show, they act as a driving force for Rick in securing more guns by helping to protect Oceanside. Sidebar real quick, a lot of bad shit has happened, so I figured I'd touch on the love interest between the two. Rick gives kisses to Andrea in the comics, whereas Andrea in the show hasn't been seen since the old governor. So unfortunately, no carnival vacation in the comic. Rick's lover in the show ends up being Michonne, hooray! Who, as I mentioned earlier, is having sleepovers with Ezekiel in the comic. Boo. Next up is Enid and Carl's youthful romance, which doesn't exist in the comics at all. There, we find Carl's heart being filled with joy by Carol's daughter, Sophia, who in the show, well, you remember. Back to reality. We're at the Kingdom. Richard the Guard turns all Nixon, sees Mellengate through, and betrays Carol in the show.
Maybe they kill her, maybe they don't.
Well, that doesn't happen at all in the comics. So Benjamin's tragic death leading to Morgan breaking his killing code is non-existent, especially since Morgan died way back in issue number 82 after being kissed on the arm by a walker. Also, Jerry, the bodyguard we know and love from the show, he isn't protecting shit in the comics.
Really?
Let's move past some more unpleasantness, shall we? The bombshell at the end of the season, Sasha's death, happens in both iterations. However, her mission with Rosita in the show doesn't happen in the comics. Instead, Sasha's story ends up mirroring Holly's in the comics. Holly is returned to Rick as a walker, a twisted present of Negan's. In the show, Negan comes to genuinely return Sasha, but she commits suicide with a pill given to her by Eugene. Fucking asshole. So Negan actually tries to use Sasha as a bartering tool in the show, whereas he uses Holly in the comic to get back at Rick. The fight in the bell tower occurs in both, but since Rick's love interest is different, so is this scene. Michonne is in the bell tower scene in the show, while in the comics it's Andrea. The battle looks lost for Rick, and Negan reacts by bringing back an old memory. He lines up his victims and puts them on their knees. In issue number 114, though, Heath and Nicholas join the lineup. In the show, neither Heath or Nicholas are in this scene. Nicholas died a while back, and Heath, we'll save that for another date. The major difference between these points is that in the show, a lot of stuff happens between Spencer's death and their first battle, whereas in the comics, they happen back to back. Before Negan can swing Lucille in the comics, Jesus jumps in and holds a gun to Negan's head. You got him, Jesus. This doesn't happen in the show at all, but Shiva's lunge to start the party brings both stories back together. The battle rages on, but both sides disperse, for now. In both the comics and the show, Negan ends it with one final decree.
We are going to war.
That does it for us today, folks. We covered a heck-ton bunch of stuff, but let us know if we missed anything you found important. Be sure to go subscribe to our YouTube, follow us on Facebook, and check out some more of our other features as well. If you're an insider, you saw this a week before everyone else, and if not, be sure to sign up. Thanks again, folks.